It's U of L Today on 93.9 The Ville. Here's your host, Mark Hebert.
Welcome to U of L Today with Mark Hebert on 93.9 The Ville. Glad you're joining us today. This is the show where we talk about all things U of L. Research, great students, great faculty members, things going on campus. And we hope by the end of this program, you'll be a little smarter and you'll know more about the University of Louisville than you knew when you started listening. So here's what we've got coming up today. Coming up in the second half of the show, John Kielkopf is an astrophysicist who studies all sorts of cool stuff out in space, gravitational waves, black holes, the search for planets beyond our solar system, and how U of L is collecting data from space and sharing it with other universities. And he will be here to talk with us about all things astronomical. Is that the right word? Having to do with astronomy. How about that? But first, the death of Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia has caused quite a tizzy in legal and political circles. President Obama, at the time of this recording, has literally just announced who he wants to be the successor to Justice Scalia. And Republicans like Kentucky Senator Mitch McConnell are vowing not to approve any nominee until a new U.S. president is elected later on this year. So with me is Sam Marcosson. He teaches constitutional law at U of L, and he's here to help sort through the legal ramifications of this big debate and the future of the U.S. Supreme Court. So welcome, Sam.
Happy to be here, Mark.
All right, so we've got to add a disclaimer here. We're recording this program shortly after President Obama announced his nominee for the Supreme Court. So for those of you who are listening, this is going to be a few days old, so there may have been something changed. But with that in mind, let's go ahead and talk about this nominee, Merrick Garland, who is the new nominee.
That's right. He is a judge currently sitting on the District of Columbia Circuit Court of Appeals, which is the step below, right below the Supreme Court. And he's been on the D.C. Circuit since 1997. He was confirmed for that job by a pretty strong bipartisan majority, 76 to 23. One thing that's important, or at least noteworthy, is that 7 current Republican senators who are now still in the Senate voted to confirm Judge Garland for his current seat on the D.C. Circuit. So it'll be interesting to see how those particular 7 Republicans are challenged and how they respond to the nomination of Judge Garland. Judge Garland's past, before he was on the D.C. Circuit, just briefly, he is a graduate of Harvard and Harvard Law School. His biggest claim to fame before going on the bench is that he was the supervisory prosecutor in the Oklahoma City bombing case while he was at the Justice Department.
So he's a former prosecutor.
He was a former prosecutor and received a lot of praise and kudos for his role across the spectrum. He was praised by senators like Orrin Hatch, for example, for his role in that, and received a lot of support to go on the bench after the role he played in the Oklahoma City prosecution. So he's widely regarded as a moderate on the bench. He's been the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit since 2013. He's 63 years old, not one of the youngest members of the court, and in modern times, one of the older nominees that any president has put forward. Presidents recently have tried to generally appoint somewhat younger people with the idea of having somewhat of a longer legacy in the appointments that they make. But Judge Garland, being in his 60s, would be somebody who probably wouldn't be on the court as long, at least if you look at actuarial tables. So we'll see how the Republicans now respond now that there's actually a name and a face to consider or not consider, as the case may be.
My suspicion is that in many minds, especially in those folks who are of the conservative bent, moderate equals liberal these days. So will it be possible, I'm certain they'll try, will it be possible for those who are more conservative to try and paint Mr. Garland as a liberal justice who should not be given a hearing by the Senate?
Well, I think there'll be 2 lines that Senate Republicans will follow. One will be a line that has nothing to do with Judge Garland whatsoever. It will be, this is the last year of President Obama's term, and we should wait for a new president so that the American public can have their voice heard. This is a line that we've already heard from Senator McConnell and others before there was ever a nomination, and that line will continue. So they won't have to say anything about Judge Garland. It'll all be about the when and the process, and they won't have to look at Judge Garland's record. It won't be anything about that. It'll all be about let's let the American public ring in and decide which next president should fill this important vacancy. As to Judge Garland, he's been on the bench since 1997, almost 20 years of issuing rulings, issuing decisions, and yes, they will certainly be able to point to some decisions of his that they will argue show that he is actually just an activist, another liberal, another, you name it, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, Stephen Breyer, Sonia Sotomayor. In particular, you've already started to see in the days when he was one of the people being speculated about, a couple of rulings or votes that he issued dealing with the issue of gun control, that he voted to at least either look at or gun control rulings or uphold gun control regulations. And so I think that may be one line of attack that conservatives bring out to try to argue that he is actually a liberal or judicial activist in moderate's clothing. So I think that will be one area that they try. I don't think, however, that Judge Garland is as susceptible to that as some of the other people who are being speculated about, who have records that actually give more ammunition for that kind of attack than Judge Garland's record does.
We're talking with Sam Marcosson, who's a professor at the University of Louisville Brandeis School of Law, and he teaches constitutional law. You know, there's going to be a lot of give and take in the next few days by the time this program airs about the qualifications of Mr. Garland, and we'll know the last time he blew his nose, I'm guessing, by the time this airs. Let's talk more about the argument on both sides about whether there should even be a hearing. As you mentioned, Republican leader McConnell has said flatly, we're not going to hear whoever the nominee is. We're not going to hold a hearing. It should be up to the next president to make that decision. We'll let the people decide. The other side is, look, President Obama is still the president. He didn't quit at the start of this year. He has the right as the president to go ahead and nominate who he wants, and the Senate should go ahead and at least hold hearings on this. And both sides have said, well, history is on our side, which either argument you're going with, history is on our side. This has been done many times before. So what is the truth?
Sure.
Have there been a number of cases where outgoing presidents have nominated nominees for the Supreme Court and the Senate has just sat on them, or have there been a number of cases where they did nominate somebody and the Senate went ahead and approved him?
History is clearly, in my view, on the side of the president in nominating and demanding that the Senate at least consider the nominee. The text of the Constitution supports the idea that the Senate can do what it wants. That is, the Constitution says the president nominates, and the Senate has the authority to give its advice and consent to that nomination. So if the Senate wants to, they can simply say, we do not consent, and that's the end of the story. But the Constitution, as Justice Scalia was very fond of saying himself, there's some irony here, is built not only on the text, but the traditions that have arisen in interpreting that text. And he was very fond of and made a strong point of always looking at the traditions that have built up in 200 years. And the tradition in history has been that the Senate, whenever a vacancy arises, especially through the death of a Supreme Court justice, as we've had here, whether it's in the first or the fourth year of a president's term, considers the nomination. Now, that doesn't always mean confirmation. Some justices...
But they at least consider it.
They at least consider it.
And hold a hearing.
And sometimes the nominee has been rejected or withdrawn because of facts that come out during the confirmation process, as happened with Harriet Miers during the last President Bush's term. But there is individualized consideration. And what happens with Judge Garland, we don't know, but the Senate would be out on a limb and doing something unprecedented if it simply said, we will not even consider this president's nominee.
You use the word unprecedented. Is that true, or is it just not the norm?
I think it's unprecedented. Certainly in the last 150 years, that the Senate simply turns a deaf ear to the president's authority. We have a separation of powers between the branches, but that also involves a mutual respect for each branch, here the president and the Senate, for the authority of the other. And when the president has the authority to nominate, the mutual respect that is owed from the Senate to the president presupposes that the Senate will give some consideration to the president as the head of a co-equal branch. Now our job is to consider that. Not necessarily confirm, but not to sort of say, we are going to refuse to even give any consideration. And the other thing I would say is that there's a real price to be paid for the Supreme Court itself. If the Senate refuses even to consider a nominee and to confirm one if that nominee here, Judge Garland, is qualified, the Supreme Court would not only go the rest of this term short-handed, but all of next term, because the next president would not take office until next January, would not have a nominee named until presumably weeks into that term, and then confirmation would go several weeks or months, and so all of the Supreme Court's next term would be without 9 full justices. And so the regard would not only be not for the president, but also for the other co-equal branch, the Supreme Court. That also would be unprecedented.
We're talking with Sam Marcosson, who's a law professor at the University of Louisville, about the Supreme Court nominee and the process and what's going to happen here in the next several months. We talked about the split on the Supreme Court, 4-4 along ideological lines for most rulings. Is that really as big a split? And will it be, is this next appointment going to tip the scale so far one way or the other that it's going to change the course of American history?
I actually think that's been overstated. Certainly an appointment to fill a justice's seat who's been as significant as Justice Scalia is important. He has been a landmark figure on the court, a strong conservative voice on the court for a very long time, 30 years. But any one appointment, any one justice, only will have so much of an impact, even for a seat like Justice Scalia's. The bigger impact comes with subsequent appointments that may affect the court over the long haul. If the next president, for example, is a conservative Republican and can fill vacancies for, let's say, Justice Ginsburg and Justice Kennedy, even if President Obama's nominee is confirmed, the court's going to go right back over the next couple of years to a conservative majority. So it takes a number of appointments, and over the long haul, actually changing the court with more than one appointment. So we can get caught up too much, I think, in thinking that one appointment by one president can make a huge difference. It can change the court in the short term, but the long term requires several appointments and confirming a new direction for the court. So this one appointment isn't going to do it just by itself.
Is it ironic that we're talking so much about politics and this being a political decision for a job that's supposed to take politics out of the equation?
Well, it certainly is ironic, and I think part of that, it reflects the extent to which the court on its docket now deals with issues that are hot button issues, and so it's become inevitable. But I think we would all benefit if the confirmation process became less politicized, and we found a way that the Senate and the President could work more closely together with more compromise and less obstruction. And that's been on both sides of the aisle. The confirmation process has over, especially the last two presidencies, the Bush presidency and the Obama presidency, have become so locked in the overall gridlock and polarization in our politics that the court has sort of been swept up in it. So a pox on both their houses as far as that's concerned. It's not just one side or the other. This takes it to a new level if the Senate won't even consider a nominee. But it's been the trend we've been seeing over decades now.
All right, Sam Marcosson, always interesting to talk to you, and we probably need to have you back on here in a few months once we find out what's going to happen with Merrick Garland, the new nominee for the U.S. Supreme Court. John Kielkopf is an astrophysicist who teaches in the physics and astronomy department at the University of Louisville, and he's here to talk about some of the mysteries of space and how U of L is trying to solve some pieces of the puzzle, what our little role is in the universe, I suppose. Right, John?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit. What do you teach at U of L?
I teach astronomy mostly and some computing, teach physicists how to use computers. Really.
All right. And from your perspective, what are some of the big discoveries that have happened in the last, I don't know, several months? And there's been a bunch of them out in space that that folks have been interested in.
Well, the questions I get, and just a few minutes ago, the leading one is, what about the big detection of merging black holes with gravitational waves? That excited everybody, and that's a major one because the people who've built the instruments have been working at it for now decades to try to enable that detection, and it's a major accomplishment to see it.
And so what's the big deal?
The big deal is that Einstein predicted this, that space could carry a wave, that gravity produces a wave in space and time that will move across the universe. Is pretty much unchanged, and we can detect, if we can see it, these events which occurred a long time ago, someplace far away, with some technology other than just seeing the light that comes from it. So just to be able to do that is the big deal, in my view, that it gives us a whole new vision on the universe that we didn't have before.
And what is that vision on the universe? For those of us who, you just described it, but it's hard to understand for the common person. Why does it matter?
Oh, well, it matters because we don't know, if just to get down to the very basics, we don't know how we fit in the universe as human beings. We are, as far as we know, unique, but in fact, every evidence that we see tells us that the probabilities are we're not. So we're just innately curious about where we came from and whether there are others like us out there looking back billions of years at this tiny speck and saying, I wonder what's over there, So this gives us a handle on that, but it also gives us a much broader view of what the universe is like as a whole and how it originated, which we still don't understand.
So I take it that you believe that there is some other life out there somewhere.
Oh yeah, I think it's inevitable because we've discovered other planets. So a few decades ago we didn't even know that existed, but now we do, and they're common. They're some unexpected varieties there, but still. The things that made those are the same things that made ours, and there's no reason to suppose that something similar to us happened there.
I always thought that it was kind of selfish of humans to think that we were the only ones in the entire, well, I was going to say the entire world, I guess the entire universe says, that we're intelligent life forms.
Yeah.
It didn't make sense. It pressed logic for me.
In fact, we're obviously unique here on Earth as human beings. We're pretty high on the intelligence chain. I'm not convinced we're the highest, but then that's
well, maybe we'll find out someday.
But on the universal scale, it seems likely we're not.
All right, we're talking with John Kielkopf, who's an astrophysicist and teaches astronomy at the University of Louisville. U of L also has some sort of collaboration with some other schools to do research in space. What is that collaboration?
Well, our biggest current one is with the University of Southern Queensland in Australia, and we have telescopes down there which we own, and they operate for us, and we operate our telescopes for them and share these resources so that our students can see the sky at night looking on the other half of the Earth and, in a sense, down, while their students can see the sky in their daytime looking up at our nighttime sky in the other direction. These are robotic or largely automated telescopes that enable us to look right now for extrasolar planets. That's our main interest.
So that's what you're doing?
That's what we're doing.
So planets outside of our solar system?
Planets around other stars, trying to find them, yeah.
So if any of our students at the University of Louisville found any and said, hey, look, there's another exoplanet out there that nobody knew about.
Our big success was Dr. Karen Collins, who was a PhD student in our program and recently graduated, and she found an exoplanet in which we call KELT, K-E-L-T. It stands for Kilodegree Extremely Little Telescope. It's that's a program we collaborate with that's now run out of Lehigh University, Vanderbilt, and Ohio State to to search for evidence of exoplanets, and then we go back with other telescopes and try to verify that. That's just a beginning. It's an ongoing project. It's been going on for many years, but the next step will be to put a satellite in space, which will do the same preliminary work from space. It'll give us a much bigger view and many more detections of planets around stars that we hope to be able to get more information about with large ground-based telescopes.
Is Pluto a planet?
It is, in my view. I mean, if you see those pictures which came back from NASA last year, how could you not call that a planet? I think the concern was that it's one of many which are out that far in the solar system, and they're so hard to find and they're so faint that that it could become innumerable to keep track of them all and to call them all members of our solar system in the same sense that, say, Jupiter is. So the decision was made by those who are allowed to make those decisions
or have the power to make those decisions.
That Pluto was not going to be a planet, and it simplified things. Well,
no, it didn't simplify things. It screwed up things. There's everything we learned in elementary school that there were 9 planets and Pluto was the last one, and then they screwed it up and said it's not a planet.
But now if you didn't do that, you'd have, I don't know, maybe a dozen. And there's some that are very planet-like, which are much closer. We don't call planets. Ceres is the closest to planets in the same class as Pluto. They're called dwarf planets, and they're round. They look like planets if you get up close. They're just not as influential on other objects around them as the bigger planets are. So we've drawn a line between those two categories.
UofL also has some agreement with the other state schools, as I understand it, correct? To do some
that's right. Yeah, this is
the
big news. We have Dr. Williger in our department is leading this effort. We're developing a collaboration with other universities in the state. It's now pretty comprehensive. I think most of the universities are participating to join what's called the LSST Corporation. It's the Large Synoptic Survey Telescope Corporation. So this is the organization that is building the major federally funded large telescope for the next decade, and we're going to be participating in that as a state, so that the universities and their students can become talented enough to use that telescope when it becomes available in the 2020s.
So it's a big fancy new telescope.
It
basically.
is, and it opens up a whole new way of doing astronomy. This is a telescope which, unlike most of those that are currently in use, which would be just pointed at an object at somebody's request, you'd get the data, and then as an astronomer, you'd sit back and analyze it. This telescope runs in largely automated fashion. It looks at the entire sky many times a week, produces just incredible volumes of data. I was, because I knew you would ask this, I was looking up just how much data that is, and it's of the order of 1,000 times the number of stars in our own galaxy in bytes of data per year. It's just incredible.
That's a lot of data.
So we call this is big data science, and the university has a thrust to learn how to do that. The obvious other sort of similar thing would be studying the genome, and it also involves comparable numbers. And so astronomers and biologists, we all have this in common, that there's just something to be discovered, and just being able to manage that massive amount of data and sift through it and find the interesting stuff.
So this is a really big deal in astronomy circles.
It is
isn't
a
it?
very big deal.
And UofL's part of it.
All of the money which the National Science Foundation is directing toward ground-based astronomy, the largest fraction of that is going into this project now.
This is John Kielkopf, who we're talking to from the University of Louisville. He's an astrophysicist, teaches astronomy at UofL. What's the coolest thing in your mind that's been found in space?
You mean everything?
I'm talking, what's the coolest thing? If you had to say, I'm an astronomer, and the coolest thing out there is blank, that somebody would just say, that knows nothing about space, knows nothing about astronomy.
Well, good question.
Did I stump you? Have I stumped you now?
No, because there's so many cool things.
Well, I'll give you the top two.
But I'll pick one that amazed me the first time I saw it, and still does today. And that is, the center of our galaxy has a black hole in it. And just to imagine that we would even know that, because we can't, with visible light, see the center of our own galaxy. There's too much dust in the way. Is an amazing fact. But what we've seen with telescopes that can view through the dust is that there are objects, probably stars and other blobs of stuff, orbiting around the central black hole. And there are pictures which have been developed from that data which show the paths of these things doing a little elliptical orbits around this thing you can't see. It's just amazing. And
so how do we know a black hole is there if we can't see it?
We know it because we see its influence on space around us. So you see the curvature of space that's produced by that, and it acts, even though you can't see it, it acts like it's there. So it would be as if you were just to take the sun away, and all the planets are still going around this point in space, but there's nothing there. And
so something has to be there for the gravitational pull.
You can measure how much matter is there by the way those things behave. So we can actually measure how much matter is stuck into that black hole in the center of our galaxy by watching these other objects move around it. That's just an amazing thing to me to see.
So you think that's the coolest thing that you can think of?
That would rank
That'd be up there.
Very high. Yeah.
All right, the gravitational wave, getting back on that for just a second, that is, as I understand it, two black holes that come together or merge, or the black holes have something to do with that gravitational wave, right?
Well, anything that moves will produce it, but two merging black holes produce a wave which is big enough that by the time it reaches us, it's still detectable.
Okay. One more question, and I want to get your thoughts on this. Scott Kelly just returned from a year in space. Is that a big deal?
Certainly is for Scott Kelly.
Well, I know. He's still alive and he's walking around.
Well, yes, it is, because he's one of a few astronauts who have stayed in space that long. But what we're trying to learn from that is how to manage long duration space travel, and it has some very significant effects on the human body. And Scott has a twin who stayed here on Earth, and so by comparing the two of them and how they go from here, we'll find out more about that. We need to be able to do that if we're going to get off Earth for a long term.
All right. Any final words, John?
Oh, thank you for
All right, John Kielkopf from the University of Louisville Astronomy Department. Thank you so much for showing up. Appreciate it. It's a pleasure. All right, and we always, at the end of each of these shows, have a little bit of trivia about the University of Louisville. So did you know UofL has been named a military-friendly school for 7 years in a row by GI Jobs magazine and consistently ranks among the best schools in the country for veterans by other rating services. So that's your Did You Know tidbit for this show. All right, you can catch me every Monday morning on Great Day Live on WHAS-TV. I always have a new and hopefully interesting story about something at the University of Louisville, and video versions of these programs are on Metro TV, which is the government access channel for the city of Louisville. That's 5 times a week that they show up. And also on KET3 at 5 o'clock on Thursday afternoon. So thank you all for listening to this program, and go Cards.